Good morning. This is Jeff Badger, the Grinding Doc, and we are continuing on learning about grinding. And in this case, we are going to talk about the fundamental first principles concept of self-excited chatter. What exactly is chatter? There's a million different types of chatter, but we're going to talk about the most common one. It's called workpiece-regenerative chatter, self-excited chatter, and I'm going to explain the fundamental method of where it comes from. Now, how to fix it is a whole nother animal, and we'll get to that in other videos. But in this video, we're just going to talk about what exactly is going on when you get chatter and when that wheel head starts and that spindle starts bouncing around. So let's take a look at what the fundamental principle or the fundamental cause of chatter is. So let's take a look about the fundamental causes or the fundamental mechanisms or what's really going on in workpiece regenerative chatter. These are pages from the 4,000 page book of grinding. If you take my course, you'll get the book of grinding. And let's see what's actually going on when we get chatter. Okay, so in grinding, and we're going to take cylindrical plunge grinding, what we can do is we consider the grinding wheel, grinding spindle, the whole assembly, to be kind of a spring because it has a certain stiffness. Now, the workpiece also has a certain stiffness, and then you combine those into the combined stiffness. But let's simplify things and say, hey, this spindle, this wheel has a certain stiffness. So what that means is that he has a tendency to bounce up and down. So if you push up on him, he's going to bounce up and down, boing, 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 boing. And if you want a number, let's go with 120 bounces per second or 120 hertz. That means that that spindle likes to bounce up and down at 120 bounces a second. That could be a typical frequency for a very unstiff ID grinding wheel. More typical in cylindrical OD would be 500 hertz or 500 bounces a second. We went for 120 here just because it simplifies the graphics. But what it means is that that wheel is bouncing up and down or likes to bounce up and down 120 bounces per second. That is his natural frequency. You can spin the wheel fast. You can spin the wheel slow. He still likes to bounce up and down 120 times a second. You can have heavy grinding, light grinding. He still likes to bounce up and down 120 bounces a second. Now, here's what happens in grinding. So now we're grinding away. We're doing cylindrical OD grinding. And we chose some values here just to make it a little easier to visualize. So let's say my wheel is going at 1800 RPM. And my workpiece is 720. That's pretty high for a workpiece RPM, but it makes it easier to visualize if we choose numbers like these. So that's 1800 and that's 720. Now, it would be nice if the force acting up on the wheel, and according to Newton's law of motion, pushing down on the workpiece was constant. It would be nice if this guy just stayed at a steady 20 pounds, 10 kilos, 100 newtons, whatever it is. It would be nice if that force was nice and steady. Unfortunately, that force is not nice and steady. It changes a little bit. It oscillates. There are harder parts of the wheel, softer parts of the wheel. Sometimes we have more material to remove. Sometimes we have less material to remove. Sometimes the coolant changes pressure a little bit. A million factors that means that that force is going to vary a little bit. And when that force varies, that is what is called an excitation source. It excites the wheel and it causes it to bounce up and down a little bit. Not much, but it just sort of causes that guy to bounce. So now that guy's going to bounce. And what frequency is he going to bounce at? He's going to bounce at 120 bounces a second. The bouncing isn't very severe, but it's still there. Boing, 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 boing. He's bouncing up and down 120 bounces a second. The workpiece is rotating at 12 revolutions per second. 120 divided by 12 is 10. So now we get 10 small little lobes on the workpiece, little waves on the workpiece, and there are 10 of them. But they're small. It's not a big deal because these are small little waves, not a problem. No big deal. It's going to happen regardless because that wheel always wants to bounce up and down at 120 bounces a second. However, here's where it gets messy. Now we've got those 10 little lobes on the workpiece, and those 10 little lobes mean that sometimes the depth of cut is a little bit bigger and a little bit smaller. Not much, but just a little bit bigger, a little bit smaller. So what does that do? It causes the normal force to vary. So now our excitation force pushing up on the wheel is going push, 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 push. And it's doing that at exactly 120 pushes per second, which is exactly the frequency we don't want to push at, or exactly the frequency we don't want to excite the system at, because that's its natural frequency. So we put 10 lobes into the workpiece, and those 10 lobes are now exciting the wheel or the wheel spindle assembly at exactly its natural frequency. It's an excitation source. So what happens? It starts bouncing. Boing, boing, boing. The depth of cut is varying, bigger or smaller, bigger or smaller. So what happens? We get bigger lobes on the workpiece. And we still have 10 of them because we're putting lobes in at the natural frequency of 120 bounces a second. And those lobes are now coming around again, and they're exciting the system at exactly 120 bounces a second. And that's exactly the frequency we don't want to excite the system at. So now things are getting bad. And what happens? Boing, 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 boing. We start exciting the system at an even higher amplitude. Same frequency, higher amplitude. Boing, 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 which means the forces are getting bigger because the depth is varying more. So now we have a vicious cycle. And what happens now? We get even bigger lobes on the workpiece. And what does that do? It changes the force excitation source to be even bigger. So what does that mean? It makes things even worse. And it's just this vicious cycle where we make things bad, and then those bad things come around again and make things worse. And those worse things come around again and make things even more worse. And next thing you know, bang, 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 chatter is out of control. And that is the fundamental mechanism of workpiece regenerative chatter, which is the most common type. There's also wheel regenerative chatter, which we'll talk about in a different video. And then there's all different types of chatter too. But when people typically think of the most common type of chatter, it is this. And basically it has to do with that wheel, that spindle bouncing up and down at its natural frequency, exciting and then causing these lobes. And then these lobes cause the system to be excited even more and more and more. And next thing you know, things are out of control. Now, we haven't told you yet how to fix it. There are different ways to fix it. You can vary the workpiece RPM. You can make your spindle stiffer. You can extend the arc length. You can slow down your RPM, which extends the arc length, a whole bunch of various factors. But the purpose of this video is just to explain the fundamental mechanism of workpiece regenerative chatter. And then in other videos or in my courses or in the book of grinding, we talk about, okay, well, there it is. How do we deal with it? How do we reduce it? How do we alleviate the problem, fix the problem? But the goal of this video is just to tell you what is the fundamental mechanism in workpiece regenerative chatter or self-excited chatter. If you want to learn more, check out my other videos or take one of my courses or get a hold of the book of grinding to tell you how to deal with workpiece regenerative chatter.